Time for a Puscast, covering the last couple of weeks of February in the year 2020. References are available at edgydoc.com, home of my multimedia empire, and the references now have DOIs to aid in your retrieval of the original sources. A correction first from the last Puscast. It was pointed out that I referred to dolutegravir as a protease inhibitor when in fact it is an integrase inhibitor. One of the problems I have with this Puscast is I don't listen to what I'm saying, and I've made mistakes like that in the past. I often call antivirals antiretrovirals because I'm not listening. But it's nice to know that Lionel was listening. Thanks, Lionel. As I've said many a time, my wife will let you know I'm not perfect. So, let's move on to the medical literature, shall we? You'll note that I'm kind of gravelly and stuffy. I'm getting over a URI that I think I picked up on a airplane ride. There was a kid coughing right across the aisle for the entire 6-hour flight, and that is the only known source of a URI that I have had. For starters, I will just point a nice article in the Journal of Infectious Diseases entitled The Cost of Drugs and Infectious Diseases, Branded Generics and Why We Should Care, a nice review of the topic. What they don't mention, however, in this particular perspective, nor in the editorial, is the fact that at the end of the day, we are spending the patient's money. And I have sent patients into bankruptcy. I've had patients lose their houses. And I've had all sorts of financial catastrophes because of the interventions that I have had to provide my patients. We think nothing of ordering unneeded CBCs and echocardiograms and God knows what all on our patients. And at the end of the day, depending on their insurance, they may be liable for 10, 20, 30% of the bill. I'd like to point out I was in-house 24 hours for small bowel obstruction. My bill was $10,000. My copay was $1,000. I don't like paying $1,000, but I'm in an income bracket where that's not that big an issue. But 40% of Americans can't cough up $400 for an emergency. Every dime we spend with our power of orders is driving our patients that much closer to financial catastrophe. So I'm very parsimonious in my ordering, and that includes always looking for the cheapest possible antibiotics, although always the best. A reminder now that we're getting towards the end, maybe, of flu season, I hope, in the beginning of coronavirus season. Yay. We have our first case here in Portland today. Yay. But remember that RSV is a significant cause of morbidity and mortality in patients that equals or sometimes surpasses influenza in its severity in patients in my age group, i.e. the elderly. Unfortunately, we don't have any good interventions for treating respiratory syncytial virus, but RSV still remains a significant source of morbidity and mortality in those that get this illness when they're in the older age group. And it's not just a trivial URI of children. Boy, time flies. 2012, there was an outbreak of hantavirus in Yosemite Valley. I could have sworn that was just a year or two ago. Anyway, as a result of the hantavirus infestation, they tried to clean out the mice population in and around areas of human habitation. And they went looking to see if that's been successful. And they found it was much more difficult in the area to trap mice, suggesting that there is a decrease in the number of mice in Yosemite Valley that carry hantavirus. And although that was not statistically significant, the seroprevalence of hantavirus in the mice was less. They also allude to the fact that part of the reason there may be less mice now than there were then is the prolonged drought that's been going on in the California area, which certainly is not good for mice. The hantavirus at Four Corners was seen in part because there was a wet season, which led to increase in the amount of grain, which led to the increase in the number of mice. Bad dry weather means no food, means no mice. and that may be part of the reason there were fewer mice and therefore less risk of hantavirus in Yosemite. Regular listeners know I have an affinity for these ecological explanations for the rise and fall of infectious diseases. It's part of what makes the field so cool. I forget who it was. He is or was an expert in anaerobes. He used to write for Medscape, and he liked to travel the United States giving talks. And he talked years ago at Citywide in Portland, and amongst the topics was avian influenza. And I always remember that one of his take-home was the risk from wild animals, wild birds, in spreading avian influenza. I remember he said at the time, you can't stop the duck. That was before Oregon became so dominant in football, but I appreciated the thought nonetheless. This study looks at the movement of ducks in France and how it led to the spread of avian influenza. And they suggested that moving ducks around, live duck movements, accounted in part for the spread of avian influenza in the duck population. And, quote, results also suggest a transmission risk of 35.5% when an infected holding moves flocks to another holding within 14 days before detection. I only mention this, one, because I think it's interesting, because indeed you can't stop the duck. But I wonder how this kind of epidemiologic information on the movement of animals would correlate with, say, any human infection spreading around the world currently. Nothing comes to mind. But there aren't a lot of difference between humans and ducks when it comes to the spread of respiratory infections, I would wager. There's a nice perspective in the New England Journal on the fact that the U.S. government is not vaccinating detainees for influenza, and they live under relatively perfect conditions for the spread of infectious diseases. Several children have died of influenza in these detainee camps, but the feds are refusing to let them be vaccinated. But when you read the report and the overcrowding and the conditions in these detention camps, here's hoping coronavirus doesn't get in there. Boy, would that be a disaster. And here is a depressing article. I had always assumed that infection led to good immunity against influenza and that you wouldn't get infected with the same strain, although because of shift and drift, you may get infected with other strains of influenza. This was a grand total of 7 patients. It was part of a trial that included challenging patients sequentially with the same strain of influenza. And guess what? They got sick the second time. Quote, at least 3 of 7 participants demonstrated confirmed laboratory evidence of sequential infection, with 5 of 7, sounds so Borgy, demonstrating clinical evidence. So you can get infected with the same strain twice. Crap! And if you're wondering how good the vaccine was this year, the interim analysis by the CDC suggests 45% efficacy in preventing influenza, more or less what it usually is. And there's a nice review in Clinical Infectious Diseases entitled Lessons from Influenza Pandemics of the Last 100 Years. Their take-home, the best way to deal with pandemics is to put someone in charge who knows nothing about science and is a science denier, and make sure not to let those who know what they're doing speak to the press. And above all, obfuscate in a way that tries to support the stock market. Yes, indeed, those are the lessons learned from prior pandemics. This study out of France asked the question that everybody wants to know. Is there an association between seropositivity for Borrelia burgdorferi and incidental neuropsychiatric disorders and functional decline in older adults? And the answer is nope, which is consistent with other studies to show a lack of relationship between prior Lyme disease and ongoing neuropsychiatric difficulties. By the way, if you're looking for a good review on syphilis, there is one in the New England Journal of Medicine this month. And there is the depressing fact of resistance to macrolides in patients with Mycoplasma genitalium. And it is remarkable. Quote, nearly 90% of MG infections were resistant to macrolides and quinolones. Men who took macrolides in the 30 days prior to enrollment had higher rates, 97% of macrolide-resistant Mycoplasma genitalium, end quote. That is a lot of resistance. This study is out of China, where a lot of the Mycoplasma pneumoniae resistance studies come from as well. Although rates reported in the United States have not been quite that high, 2/3 as a rule of thumb are resistant to those agents. MRSA accounts for maybe 2% tops of community-acquired pneumonia. So what is the benefit of adding anti-MRSA therapy to standard antibiotic therapy for patients with hospitalization for pneumonia? And the answer is adding therapy for MRSA did not improve mortality or outcomes. But patients who received MRSA therapy had, all right, this is key, this should be practice changing, an increased risk of death, kidney injury, C. difficile, VRE, and secondary gram-negative rod infections. And this is not the only study to show adverse outcomes to starting and or prolonging long-term broad-spectrum antibiotics, or what some of you might call big gun, strong, and powerful, i.e., the very people who should never be giving those antibiotics in the first place. But it has been a consistent finding in epidemiologic studies. The more big gun, strong, and powerful unneeded antibiotics you give, the worse patients tend to do. You're not doing anybody any favors by giving them vancomycin when they don't have MRSA pneumonia. When I hear the word melioidosis, I think of Southeast Asia and Australia. But there are increasing number of cases of melioidosis being reported in the Caribbean. Puerto Rico is one, and Guadalupe is now another. So it would appear that melioidosis, for whatever reason, may be gaining a toehold in the Caribbean area. One of the things you realize when you're an infectious disease doctor is no place is safe, no food is safe, no fluid is safe. Everything is an infection risk, which is why I am so much fun at parties. One of those general evolutionary rules of thumb in infectious diseases is that resistant organisms are less fit in an antibiotic-free environment and so tend to be outcompeted and disappear. This has been proven not true with MRSA, with tuberculosis, and now E. coli, where they found a pandemic strain of multi-drug resistant E. coli. For those of you who care, it's the ST131-H3OR or the ST1193 clonal groups. Not only are these uropathogenic organisms, but they tend to persist in the gut for prolonged periods of time. Prolonged being 250 days. So being resistant to multiple antibiotics was not a negative feature for these organisms. It's more in the world of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And as long as we're on the topic of urinary tract infections, the current recommendations for the use of phosphomycin are single dose. There was a study back in JAMA a while back that compared to single dose phosphomycin versus 3 doses of nitrofurantoin and found the phosphomycin to be inferior. My take on this was that you need to give more doses of phosphomycin. In Europe, they give up to 6 weeks of phosphomycin for prostatitis with good outcomes and little morbidity. So for the last year, I've been recommending when you treat complicated or recurrent urinary tract infections to give 3, 4, 5 doses of phosphomycin. There's now a study that looked at a smattering of patients who had complicated urinary tract infections who were giving multiple doses of phosphomycin, and it was usually effective. And it wasn't particularly toxic. So it's nice to see the literature is catching up to my practice. Yes, I'm that self-absorbed. Again, a lot of the joys of infectious diseases come from understanding why patients get infections. I've seen some interesting nocardia infections in my day. I had one pneumonia that I saw in a patient who I think got it from his hay barn. He was a renal transplant patient, and he had a hay barn that he would go into daily, and hay is filled with nocardia. I had another patient with a nocardia sternal wound infection who loved to dig in his own giant mulch pile. So I enjoyed this particular article, Nocardia ignorata. I wonder who that was named after. It has to be a diss of someone. But they have a 55-year-old who developed nocardia pneumonia, and he was a gardener, and they think that was the source, which is kind of a sweet explanation for an unusual nocardia. Although I suspect the rotting organic material I'm seeing the most disease from is marijuana and Aspergillus pulmonary disease. I mean, really, Bill Clinton had it right. Don't inhale. You always wonder if all the new azoles are the same. There's voriconazole and posaconazole and isovuconazole. And are they the same? This study looked at the use of isovuconazole in patients with hematologic malignancies or stem cell transplants as a prophylactic. And they found an increase in invasive fungal infections on medication, predominantly with Aspergillus. So whether that's going to end up being true in subsequent studies or not, I do not know, but it does give pause that one would want to use isovuconazole in patients with hematologic malignancies as a prophylactic. And a study that shows that itraconazole is inferior to voriconazole in patients with chronic pulmonary aspergillosis. But I would wonder, why would anybody give itraconazole for Aspergillus? Yeah, it has some efficacy in much the same way that I would have some efficacy against Mike Tyson in the ring. But come on, really? And other data has shown that itraconazole for Aspergillus is better at developing azole resistance than it is actually treating the infection. Itraconazole, I would think, is an antibiotic of historical interest for treating that particular mold, and this study at least confirms that fact. Although there was no difference in mortality in the patients, generally speaking, I've been unimpressed with anything we use for chronic pulmonary aspergillosis. I think vori and posaconazole are less bad than itraconazole, although I've cured a couple. Generally speaking, when you think of coccidioidomycosis, you think of the San Joaquin Valley of California and places downwind of that valley, and then, of course, Central and South America. But there is a little nidus of cocci in western Washington, in Walla Walla, which is along the Columbia River and famous for their sweet onions. But now there are a case of cocci in someone from Spokane, Washington, which is significantly north of Walla Walla, a couple hundred miles. And the patient had no risk, no travel, or exposure to think that they got the cocci from anywhere but home. So it might be that cocci is changing its ecological niche in Washington as well. The article in Emerging Infectious Diseases has a very nice map on the second page of the distribution of cocci in Washington. Of course, the Oregon side is a lot prettier, and we don't have sales tax. I don't actually know, but I suspect this is yet another example of the changing range of infectious diseases as the climate of our planet goes down the toilet. Oh, I mean, global warming. There are some words I just hate. One of them is autochthonous, AUTO, and then all of a sudden it turns into an H.P. Lovecraft monster, CHTH. What the hell are those four consonants doing there? And then it's ONOUS, and you just look at the word, you go, auto. Now I can't remember how to pronounce it again. So let's just pretend that that particular word has been pronounced and pronounced correctly. Because there's a case in Missouri, or in this case probably Missouri, where a patient got Chagas disease from Missouri without travel. And although Trypanosoma cruzi is found throughout the American South, it is fairly unusual to find cases that have been acquired in state. And this is a case of that in the United States. They say in this MMR report that there are only 28 other cases acquired under those circumstances with the word that I can't pronounce because of all those H.P. Lovecraft consonants. We need a new word for that, if you ask me. And as I've said before, the world revolves around me. And there are a variety of hypotheses for why there's not more Chagas spread in the United States, from the construction of houses, which keeps the reduvid bug out so it doesn't feed at night, to the fact that the reduvid bug in the United States does not poop where it eats. And the way the bug is passed is it's dining on you, it has a bowel movement, and then you scratch its feces into your skin. The American reduvid bug is much kinder. It likes to walk away and take a dump somewhere else. So it's the fastidiousness and politeness of the U.S. reduvid bug that probably accounts for the lack of disease in the United States. And an interesting article on strongyloides out of Japan that adds to the risk factors for chronic and disseminated strongyloidiasis. The classic has always been steroid use, and to a lesser extent, transplant and cirrhosis. What this article adds to the list is concomitant HTLV1 infection, a disease that's endemic in Japan. But we have neither strongyloides nor HTLV1 in the U.S. And you might know that my role model at some level is Mycroft Holmes. He was Sherlock's smarter brother, but he never liked to leave his gentleman's club, the Diogenes Club. And no, in Victorian England, it wasn't a strip club. He would like to have people bring all the information to him. He would then render an opinion that was virtually always right, and everyone was happy. There is data to support telemedicine for infectious disease, accomplishing the same goal as being Mycroft Holmes. The vast majority of infectious disease cases can be solved without the need of a physical exam, and like Mycroft, we could do all the work from the comfort of our armchair, cigar in one hand, snifter of brandy in another. That's how infectious diseases needs to go. And that brings us to the end of this particular Puscast, a review of the infectious disease literature of note for the last 2 weeks or so of February in the year 2020. It's a short month, even though it is a leap year, so there's always slightly less literature the last 2 weeks of February. I'm sure it will pick up again in the month of March. References as well as links to my multimedia empire are still available at edgydoc.com. And here's hoping coronavirus miraculously goes away. I would doubt it, because at the end of the day, infections are a real honey badger. Otherwise, thank you for this most interesting consultation and allowing me to participate in the care of this most difficult and challenging case. I shall continue to follow along with you. Thank you in dictation, and take it away, Jeff.